This is Michael Medved. Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, once said that God offers special protection to drunkards, lost dogs, children, and the United States of America. We'll explore that special protection and what it means in The American Miracle. Subscribe to The American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi everyone, this is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World Podcast.
Welcome to Pax Britannica. Elections from History. New Zealand, 1919. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, thank you to my House of Lords. Trueheart has been elevated from Viscount to Earl. Josiah Pruce is now Earl of Carlisle. Jack, Baron de Backer. Robert, Baron Bowles. Michael, Baron Phoebus. And Kev, Baron Hill. If you want to join their ranks and listen to the podcast ad-free, go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica. Today we have something slightly different. Last week was my graduation, and because I was so busy with family and travelling and getting bopped on the head by someone speaking Latin, I didn't have much time for the script. But I thought, why not put part of that phone book I call a thesis to good use, especially since it's this week of all weeks. Here in the UK, we have a general election on Thursday. Why am I bringing up elections? Well, part of my dissertation looked at general elections in the British Empire during and after the First World War. So I thought I'd pick one that was pretty unique, the 1919 New Zealand general election, and talk a bit about it. This is also going to be mostly off the cuff. I have notes, but there's no script, apart from this bit. Hope you enjoy. So the first thing to know is that in New Zealand at this time there are two main political parties. The Liberal Party, led by Sir Joseph Ward, and the Reform Party, led by William Massey. The Liberal Party had a long history going back into the Victorian era, and Joseph Ward had been a Prime Minister multiple times before. They tended to draw their support from the cities. The Reform Party was more conservative and was actually quite new. It came about in the first decade of the 20th century from an alliance of farmers' unions and Political Reform League, hence the name. Now, since 1912, they'd been in government under William Massey, and in 1914 they won re-election. Now, of course, something else happens in 1914. The First World War breaks out. And after many months of wrangling and political negotiations, the two parties, Reform and the Liberals, unite into a single national government. They form a coalition in the greater interests of New Zealand and the British Empire. Now, from the beginning, this coalition was built on very shaky ground. For starters, the two parties are very different politically. You have the Conservative Reform Party, which is trying to represent the interests of the farmers, and you've got the left-wing Liberal Party trying to represent the interests of the urban workers. And those two priorities are going to clash during a war. Whose work gets prioritised, whose goods are requisitioned, or subsidised, or anything like that. But beyond the political disagreements, you have the minor issue that Massey and Ward despised each other. They really did. They were almost the opposite people. So you have Massey, who is a Protestant Ulsterman. He was born in Ulster. He moved to New Zealand, an immigrant or a colonist, depending on how you want to see it. He's led Orange Lodges. Opposing him is Ward. Ward is a first-generation Irish Catholic. And besides any religious or cultural or ethnic differences between them, they just really didn't like each other on a personal level. In the national government, Ward becomes Massey's deputy, and he also becomes the Minister of Finance. And it's a very difficult working relationship, but it does seem to work. The Liberals get a decent proportion of the ministerial seats, and, things truck on. But things get a bit more complicated as the war carries on. After the government of Herbert Asquith falls in London and David Lloyd George takes over, he sends out an invitation to a special session of the Imperial Conference. The Imperial Conference was a semi-regular gathering of the prime ministers and leading statesmen of the self-governing colonies of the British Empire. So at this point, they are called the Dominions, and they are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland. There was meant to be one in 1914 or 1915, but because of the war, it was pushed back. At these normal peacetime conferences, the Dominions and Britain discussed matters of mutual concern, trade, immigration, a little bit of foreign policy, but it was very much the case that is Britain's remit. That's not for the Dominions to have a say. That's very different at the Imperial War Conference and Imperial War Cabinet. One of the immediate reforms which Lloyd George puts into place as soon as he takes power is he creates what he calls the War Cabinet, and it's a very slimmed down version of the normal cabinet. So the people that are needed to fight the war, not necessarily everyone who would be in a normal cabinet. And this obviously upsets the people who are excluded, but it is much more efficient. And Lloyd George, when he announces this invitation, is explicitly asking the Dominions to send prime ministers to this cabinet to discuss. And this is, unprecedented. This is the Dominions being invited into the executive body of the British Empire. With the exception of Australia, who are having their own political crisis, all the Dominions send their prime ministers. But what happens when a Dominion has two prime ministers? Because that is essentially what the national government of New Zealand was. It's certainly how Ward saw it. He saw himself as an equal to Massey. By complete coincidence, both men, Massey and Ward, were in Europe when the invitation came out. They hadn't been there for this Imperial Conference. There had been no Imperial Conference planned, but they'd been in Europe to see what they could do, to meet the troops on the front lines, that kind of thing. And because neither man could trust the other to stay behind, or go alone, they both went. So they happened to be in Europe when Lloyd George's invitations were made. Now at first, the British were very confused. Why would Ward be invited as well? This is only for prime ministers. But Massey made it clear that if Ward wasn't invited, Ward was going to go off home alone, and Massey could not afford that. So they both got a seat at the table, they both shared responsibilities. When matters of economic concern came up, Ward was quite handy. He's the Minister of Finance, he's the numbers guy. Both Massey and Ward had a voice on the committees which decided Britain's war aims. Massey was on the territorial subcommittee, and Ward was on the non-territorial subcommittee, which reparations and tariffs and things like that. When the conference was done, they sailed home. They arrived to cheering crowds, but that hid some very serious political dysfunction. In their absence, the coalition carried on as best it could, but cracks were showing. A lot of people, inside and outside Parliament, were quite annoyed that Massey and Ward had been away for so long. It wasn't really their fault, but everyone was happy to see them back and hoped they'd be there for a decent amount of time. And then, just a few months later, the second Imperial War Cabinet was summoned, and Massey and Ward sailed away again. They were back in New Zealand by the 12th of October 1918, and then the armistice was declared, so they sailed away again, because the Dominions were going to be consulted on the peace terms. When they arrived in Britain, they learned that only Massey had been invited to the Paris Peace Conference. Now this made neither of them happy. Massey would have been happy to leave Ward behind, stick him in a broom closet for all he cared, but that would mean that New Zealand only had one representative. And that was a problem, because there were some states, some allied nations, that hadn't contributed as much, hadn't suffered as much in the First World War than New Zealand, and yet they would have 2 or 3 representatives. And the other downside is, of course, that Ward said if he wasn't allowed to attend, he'd go home. And Massey couldn't let Ward out of his sight, because they did not trust each other at all. He was terrified that if Ward went home on his own, he'd become acting Prime Minister, and who knows what trouble he could cause. So they both lobbied the British, and eventually they decided, okay, fine, you can both come. But they needed to get the agreement of France and the United States, who both reacted to the proposal with confusion. Because to them, it just seemed like, imagine if the President of the United States was at a conference, and also there was the Governor of Arkansas. A weighty position and an important person, certainly, but internally, domestically. On an international level, it doesn't really register. So Britain then had to explain to their allies, no, the United Kingdom is representing the British Empire as a whole, but parts of that British Empire are self-governing. They have dominion status. They have their own priorities. They have their own legislatures. They are responsible to their own parliaments. And please, please, please just go along with this because it would make everyone's job easier. They didn't say it like that exactly, but that is the energy in the discussions. France and America weren't happy, but they were won over eventually. And so what happens at the Paris Peace Conference is there's a British Empire delegation, which is a panel system with prime ministers from the dominions brought in when their interests are discussed. And separate to that, they have individual representation for the dominions. And this is unprecedented, but it's not unrepeated. The dominions get their own representation in the League of Nations. The dominions start making their own treaties with other nations outside of British overall control. And it's a major step on the road towards the modern nations of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa. At the Paris Peace Conference, Massey and Ward played their parts. They argued for the retention of certain German colonies which New Zealand troops had captured. They argued against the racial equality clause put forward by Japan, although on both issues they mostly left Billy Hughes, the Prime Minister of Australia, to carry that burden and, take most of the heat. And at the end of it, Massey signs the Treaty of Versailles, another major step towards modern nationhood. So with all that done, the two men sail back to New Zealand. So, after all of that run-up, we're now going to talk about the actual 1919 general election. And there's two very important elements in this election. The first is sectarianism. The 1919 election is dominated by religious bigotry in a way that it never happened before or since. So let's talk about the Protestant Political Association. The PPA was set up by an Australian Baptist pastor called Howard Elliot, and this exploded in membership during the war and immediately afterwards. The PPA was deeply, deeply conservative and reactionary and stridently anti-Catholic. This also meant anti-Irish, because in New Zealand at this point, the two were synonymous. And even without the religious connection, the PPA was excessively patriotic, perhaps, and the Easter Rising in Ireland and the ongoing Irish War of Independence made Irishness seem untrustworthy. Joseph Ward was a liberal, a Catholic, and Irish, and so the PPA hated him. The PPA boasted they had 200,000 members at its height. It had the backing of the Orange Lodge in New Zealand, and it had, as we'll cover in a minute, an informal alliance with Massey's Reform Party. The other element of the 1919 election, which is so influential on the results, was the rise of the Labour Party. New Zealand's Labour Party was very new. It had only unified during the war, and this would be its first general election. Now, the Labour Party was increasingly popular. Cities had grown during the war with jobs and industrialisation, and besides any stresses or problems caused by the war which the Labour Party claimed it was going to address, there was also the fact that the national government meant that both Reform and the Liberals were in government. They were responsible for these policies, and a lot of people wanted a change. With the Labour Party now drawing voters from the cities, this was a direct threat to the Liberal Party. Labour was also hated by the PPA, who saw them as a bunch of radical left-wing Irish Catholics. So, shortly after Massey and Ward get back into New Zealand, Ward ends the coalition. He seizes the initiative. While he'd been away, his party had voted to end the coalition. With the war over, there was no reason to stay in bed with Reform. Ward managed to convince them not to pull the trigger until he was back. His allies had already drafted a manifesto by the time he announced his resignation, and he did so in a really dramatic, public way. He resigned and he published his resignation letter in the press, alongside the manifesto. The manifesto aimed for the political centre. He didn't want to scare conservative voters, but he needed to win back those left-wing votes that were going towards Labour. To thread that needle, the manifesto promised no new taxes, but also promised a vast range of infrastructure projects and social programs. And people, even liberal supporters, were a bit sceptical at this. In modern language, we'd call it uncosted. But it was a very popular manifesto. Massey was left flat-footed, not just because Ward had so abruptly resigned and taken half the cabinet with him, but because of the timing of his resignation. He resigned just a few days before Parliament was due to reconvene. So now, at the same time, he had to find replacement ministers for those Liberals who'd just left, he had to do all the work to prepare for a parliamentary session, and he had to get the ball rolling on an election campaign. Now, Massey's response is kind of petulant. He just kind of whinges and says, "This is unfair, that was ungentlemanly of you." And it was a work of political ruthlessness, but at the same time it's hard to see why Massey was surprised. It was hardly a secret that the Liberals and the Reform really didn't get on. The war was over, which meant that the reason for the coalition was gone. The Liberal MP's wish to dissolve the coalition was known to Reform. And yet he didn't really do anything to prepare. But any advantage that Ward might have won from his very abrupt resignation was lost because he stumbled. He could have called a vote of no confidence when Parliament met, and he would probably have won this with the assistance of the Labour MPs, and then an election would be immediately called without giving Reform any more time to prepare. But Ward didn't want to do anything which jeopardised the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. By the time that was done, polling day was scheduled for the 17th of December for Pakeha voters, and any momentum Ward had won was now lost. But at the same time, it kept the Treaty of Versailles politically neutral. Neither party could really claim ownership of it, because both parties had been involved in its ratification. Once the campaign was underway, it really became a dirty fight. You had the Labour Party and the Liberal Party being accused of disloyalty to New Zealand, to the Empire, because of their political leanings, because of their religion, because of their ethnicity. And some of it gets quite conspiratorial. A lot of Eliot's pamphlets talk about how Ward is secretly working with the Pope to undermine British rule, and to convert New Zealand to popery and things like that. The Labour Party is accused of being in league with the Bolsheviks, which is a bit closer to the truth. You have several candidates really making that hard to deny. There's a speech reported in one of the newspapers of a Labour candidate who's saying that if he was in Ireland, he'd be a Sinn Féiner. If he was in Russia, he'd be a Bolshevik. And you've got a great response from a supporter who's there, who can tell that this is not doing the party any good electorally, and that the party should either reject his comments, expel him from the party, or, if all that failed, quote, chloroform him. Now, Ward was able to fend off a lot of these attacks by virtue of being such a long-standing figure in New Zealand politics. He'd been Prime Minister before. He'd been in government for longer than that. He'd attended imperial conferences. He'd helped fund the HMS New Zealand, which, very coincidentally, arrived back in port just in time for the election. Wider than Ward were the Liberal Party's imperial credentials. They could point to the times that the Liberal Party had led the charge, like in the Boer War. It was a bit tricky to isolate achievements that had taken place during the national government, but they did still try. It was actually a good thing for them that Reform was never attacked for being disloyal, because they didn't have that record of experience to draw from. All they had was the last 7 years of office, and most of that had been part of the coalition. Massey was helped that, whatever his deal with Ward, however equal they were meant to be, Massey was Prime Minister. He was Prime Minister at the Imperial War Conference, the Imperial War Cabinet, and at the Paris Peace Conference. It was his signature that was on the Treaty of Versailles. He had been Prime Minister during the war. He had led New Zealand to victory. Massey and Reform could also rely on the support of the PPA. Now, people then and now point out that they were probably working together. But such an alliance was never formal, was never announced, and was always strenuously denied by everyone. Nevertheless, the PPA backed every single Reform candidate, except for one, and that was for very specific reasons. Eliot seems to have held the ambition that once Reform swept to victory, they would owe him. He would be the real power behind the throne. With the PPA acting as a pressure group on the outside, Reform would veer more and more right, more and more conservative and reactionary. That was Eliot's hope, at least. He even went so far as to say, quote, "There was practically no Reform Party now." And there was some circumstantial evidence that did suggest that the PPA and Reform were working together. In October, Eliot predicted that the new Reform Manifesto was about to be released. Lo and behold, it was just a few days later. But all the time, the PPA and Reform insisted there was no relation whatsoever, that the PPA was above party. It had nothing to do with any particular party, it just wanted what was best for the country. They just so happened to constantly back Reform. And on Reform's side, the candidates were desperate to get the votes of the PPA that the PPA could bring them, but they still wanted to distance themselves from the unpalatable bigotry that came with it. So in one case, you've got a candidate saying that he's thrilled to see all these loyal men and women of the PPA supporting him, but then he insists that he has no connection to the PPA, and he would never, quote, he would never be party to anything that would lead to sectarian strife. In another constituency, the Liberal candidate criticised a PPA pamphlet. This led the Reform candidate to deny any association with the PPA, even though the Liberal candidate had never suggested an association. Over and over again, Reform candidates were asked about their connection to the PPA, and by and large they all said, "I have nothing to do with them, but I welcome their votes." There is one candidate I saw who was actually a member of the PPA, and he acknowledged that he was, but then he said, quote, "I don't approve of certain actions and certain statements." There's a lot more we could say about the 1919 campaign, but now we turn to the results. And on the surface, it seems like a landslide victory for Massey and a humiliating defeat for Ward. Out of 80 seats, Reform won 46. This gave him his majority, but it actually disguises a significant drop in vote share. The Liberal Party had 34 seats at the last election. At this, they only won 19. They lost 15 seats. And the reason that this election is so noteworthy is that one of those lost seats was Joseph Ward's. He had held that seat since 1887, for more than 30 years. Part of the reason for that loss, and for the general loss of the Liberals overall, was the success of the Labour Party, which received almost a quarter of all the votes cast, though they only won 8 parliamentary seats, because that's first past the post. Those votes cut into the Liberal Party's votes, and that helps explain the collapse. But I think most importantly, and especially for Joseph Ward's own seat, was the role of the PPA. Though Reform and Massey would reject any suggestion that the PPA had been instrumental, they were. Ward certainly thought so, and he found the rejection of his constituents very hard to take. Out of Parliament, he'd stay out of politics for another few years before eventually making a comeback and uniting with the Reform Party to take on Labour. He'd actually be Prime Minister once again after Massey dies. So, Massey. Now, the traditional historiography is that Massey was just, a bigot, a Protestant zealot who hated Catholics and hated Irish Catholics especially, and was hand in glove with Eliot. But that has been challenged recently. He's been rehabilitated slightly to be comparatively tolerant, which is, damning with faint praise. He'd led an Orange Lodge, but now seemed to view the PPA as an embarrassment more than anything. And more than one historian credits Massey with orchestrating the decline of the PPA as an effective political force. And he did so by basically doing everything the PPA wanted. His new government enacted legislation against Catholics and left-wing radicals, which either eroded civil rights or were more style than substance, depending on which historian you look at. Whether this was real persecution or just play acting, it did the job, because it convinced the PPA rank and file that the Dominion had been under threat from radicals and zealots and papists, but now the danger had passed, so now there was no need to remain a member of the PPA. I also argue in my thesis that we have to look at the wider picture. In 1919, the Soviet Union is persona non grata, and the Russian Civil War is still going on, with all the terrible press and news that's coming out of that country, making all left-wing politics slightly suspect by association. In Ireland, a war for independence is raging, directly against the British Crown. But just 2 years later, things had changed. Relations between the Soviet Union and the British Empire had been normalised with the Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement. In Ireland, the war for independence was soon to end with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which, though it did spark a civil war, did mean that there was now an Irish Catholic state within the British Empire, the dominion of the Irish Free State. It was effective independence, just like New Zealand had. The spike in sectarianism in New Zealand politics came about because of wider imperial events, and it died down largely because of that too. Massey was just able to ride that wave to a strong majority. Right, that's it. Thank you for listening. If you'd never heard about the 1919 New Zealand general election before, well, then you're very welcome. If you're in the UK and you're registered to vote, please do, and remember you have to bring ID to the polling station. Remember that you can join the mailing list to get news about the show by going to the link in the description. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com. Thank you to everyone who has left reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to my entire House of Lords, and of course, thank you to you for listening.